Okay, so before we get started, let me just distribute to everybody the bibliography for today's texts. So if you are interested in this stuff and you want further information, or you decide at one point you want to write a paper on this, these are the sources to go to. Okay, so before we begin talking about today's text, does anybody have any questions about the response paper you have due on Friday, or about anything else concerning the structure of the class or the assignments? I'll give you a minute to think about that.
I think I would.
Okay. I do want to remind everybody too that I will look. I'll look stuff over for you if I get it by Thursday, right? So if you want me to look at it before you turn it in, get me something by Thursday. And just email it to me. Don't submit it to the Georgia View folder if you want me to look it over. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the French Revolution. What do you guys already know about the French Revolution, if anything?
It was the first time the guillotine was employed.
Okay, yeah, the guillotine is the big thing that people tend to know, right? Although the guillotine doesn't really appear until the revolution is already pretty far along. What were you going to say to that?
I was going to say that the lower class sort of comes together and goes against the upper class.
Yeah, we have here a situation where the lower classes come together and essentially overthrow the aristocracy, right? This doesn't end up being a permanent change. The aristocrats come back early in the 19th century, yeah, at least for the moment, yeah, we have a situation where the lower classes overthrow the aristocracy and the church. Right? It's important that we note that they overthrew both of these groups, at least temporarily, because of the way French society was structured in the late 18th century. So we'll talk about that as we sort of get going here. But what else do you guys know about the French Revolution? Yeah, go ahead.
It and the Russian Revolution mirrored each other in their similarity.
Okay, particularly in terms of this, right, and in terms of the fact that both ended up resulting in a dictatorship, right? So yeah, so there are parallels with later revolutions, although not so many with earlier revolutions. What were you going to say, Vermont?
There was this writer, and he had published in the newspaper that they should go off with the heads of the king and queen, and that's what got a lot of people to go up and off against them.
Okay, yeah, I think we actually give writing and publishing a little bit more credit than it deserves for what happened in the revolution. There are basically kind of two wings here of revolutionaries. On the one hand, you do have these groups of mostly middle class writers and philosophers who are reading the works of people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Denis Diderot, Voltaire, and who see the opportunity to create a new kind of society, right? Then on the other hand, you have the poor and the working classes who are really just outraged by the egregious inequality in late 18th century France, right? We're there, digging in the muck for food while these gilded carriages carrying aristocrats go past them and don't even look at them, right? One of the things that sparks the riot that Burke talks about, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, right, was the revelation that the King of France's bakeries were full of bread while the people were starving. So, yeah, so we've got really kind of two groups working from separate directions here. And this group eventually kind of takes leadership of the whole enterprise, for better and worse in various ways. Nick, what were you going to say?
I was going to talk about the riot at the Bastille.
Okay, yeah, that's really kind of the catalyzing incident, right? Is, yeah, July 14th, 1789. The storming of the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was an important symbolic target, largely because it housed political prisoners. Right? People whom the French regime wanted to keep quiet. You know, people who published books they didn't want people reading. People who spoke out against Louis XVI or his family, right? People who criticized the regime a little bit too freely. There were actually very few prisoners in the Bastille at the time it was stormed. Again, this was mostly a kind of symbolic action. But it did also, it presaged future violence in that when the revolutionaries got hold of the commandant of the Bastille, he was the first serious casualty of the revolution. Right? They got their hands on him and they killed him. Anything else you guys know about the French Revolution, or any impressions you have about the French Revolution before we get into these texts?
Pretty violent.
Yeah, that's the basic picture history gives us of it, is that it's extremely violent. Right? So the blood running in the streets. Edmund Burke talks about scattered limbs everywhere, right? This is not so much an accurate picture of the revolution itself as it is of the revolution's aftermath and the new government that is set up under Maximilien Robespierre after the revolution. I'm not saying the revolution itself was without violence, but the image we have, for example, aristocrats being dragged to the guillotine and beheaded, that is mostly something that comes after the revolution itself, right? So let's talk a little bit about this word revolution. What do we take the word revolution to mean?
New growth.
Okay, yeah, so right, we use it to refer usually to something new happening, right? The old is overturned, right? The old is overthrown, and something new comes out of it, right? Now, this was not the way the word was typically used in the late 18th century, when the American Revolution and the French Revolution occurred. Revolution, in English, simply means a turning. And prior to the late 18th century, revolution meant a return to a prior status quo. So to give you an example of this, a century before the French Revolution, there was also a revolution in England. it was referred to, and is still referred to in British history, as the Glorious Revolution. In which James II, defender of the faith, monarch of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and so on and so forth, right, is overthrown by his daughter Mary and her husband, the Dutch nobleman William of Orange, who then ruled jointly as Mary II and William III. So this is going on from about 1688 to 1690. Now, have any of you ever heard of this before? Are any of you familiar with the Glorious Revolution at all? Yeah, Jamal, what do you know about it?
I mean, I don't really remember much. I just remember the name of it and James said.
Okay. And then William's armies chase James throughout Ireland, right? Where there are more sympathizers to James's cause. And eventually they run him to ground and kick him out of the country in 1690. So none of you then know why James is overthrown, apart from just kind of generally being kind of a lousy king. James was also Catholic. And remember what we talked about last time we discussed the Gothic, right? About British identity and religion. What does religion have to do with British national identity?
Them being Protestant.
Yeah, Protestantism is baked into the British idea of national identity, right? The Church of England as an independent British church that is free from outside influence, right? That is free from the influence of the Pope in Rome. So to have a Catholic monarch sitting on the throne and also then being the head of the Church of England was more than a lot of people would stand. William and Mary were Protestants. So the reason this was called a Glorious Revolution was because it was regarded as a return to normalcy, right? We had this aberration, we had this Catholic monarch, and now we've got Protestants on the throne again. So everything's back to normal. So in this case, revolution, again, right, meant, return to point of origin, return to center, right? It's really the French Revolution that cements in the English language and the public imagination the idea of a revolution as a violent overthrow of the old order and replacing it with something else entirely. After 1789, we don't really use the word revolution in this old way so much anymore. So, what does a revolution in France have to do with English literature? Kind of a lot, actually. First off, one thing we have to look at is the geopolitical situation in the late 18th century. Who was Britain's big rival for global dominance in the 18th century?
I'm guessing
It was France, yes. Yes, that's the $100 question there. If I had $100, I would give it to you. But I don't, so I won't. Yes, France and Britain were and remained the great powers in Europe, right? They had battled each other across North America, across the 18th century, fighting for influence, fighting over colonies. There were naval skirmishes in the Caribbean between the two. And yeah, there was a kind of like general state of low-grade war between France and England for a very long period of time, right? You know, think of it as being kind of like the Cold War in American history. You know, there's kind of like this period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that erupts in little proxy wars here and there, but rarely, rarely into actual full-on conflict. And then in 1789, this happens, and responses in England vary quite a bit. On the one hand, there are people who are elated that Britain's biggest rivals seem to be, from their perspective, shooting themselves in the foot. There are other people who are elated that the French commoners are rising up against their corrupt masters and showing people a new way to live. There are also people who are terrified that this revolutionary violence is going to spill over into England, that the English common people will take this as an example of what they ought to do to their kings, and others who are hoping that the English people who will take this as an example of what they should do to their kings, right? So there's a good deal of argument about this in this kind of newly established public sphere, right? You know, people having conversations about this in coffee houses, newspapers, printing stories, sometimes lurid stories about what's going on in the French revolutions, and also a kind of pamphlet war between figures like Edmund Burke, who represents one version of the conservative position on the revolution, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who represents a more liberal position. Now, I think it's also important, once again, that we reiterate what conservative and liberal mean in this context. So, try to remind me from a few sessions ago, right? What does a British conservative believe in the 18th century? What's most important to them?
Money.
Pardon?
Money.
Well, money is actually not what's most important to them in the 18th century. What are they interested in protecting?
The crown, or they're just old values.
Yep, the crown, tradition, aristocratic privilege, and private property, right? Yep, monarchy, tradition, aristocracy. So the revolution in France makes British conservatives nervous for a number of reasons, right? While they might be happy to see that France is, from their perspective, floundering, they're also worried about what might happen in England as a result. Liberal, in the 18th century sense, refers primarily to people who wanted to expand the rights of ordinary people. So they're focused on human rights in the abstract. And in particular, expanding voting rights. Because in this period, as I believe we might have mentioned, but it probably bears repeating, most British subjects could not vote for members of parliament. Only people who owned relatively substantial amounts of property were permitted to vote for their district's member of parliament. So the franchise was restricted, franchise meaning the right to vote, right? The franchise was restricted primarily to wealthy landowners, or city people who didn't own land but had a good bit of money, right? So yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
So was it open to men and women who own land, or just for men?
Just men. And in fact, there were some districts, rural districts, with very, very small populations These were referred to as rotten boroughs. And these rotten boroughs are a form of gerrymandering, right? Essentially, like, these were places where there were maybe only 2 or 3 people who were actually eligible to vote. And so they would collude amongst themselves to put up a candidate who would then pursue their interests in Parliament, right? So this is all stuff that is going to be reformed in the 19th century, but this is the status of British political life at the end of the 18th century. And what's happening in France threatens to upend all of this, right? So it would probably help if we have a timeline of events leading up to Burke and Wollstonecraft's publications of these pamphlets, right? So we've already noted that the first real incident of the French Revolution was the storming of the Bastille. Prior to this, the thing that provoked the storming of the Bastille was a financial crash. Right, you know, just as the 2008 financial crash inspired both Occupy Wall Street on the left and the Tea Party on the right, the French Revolution was directly inspired by a collapse of the French economy. Some of this was due to the profligate spending of the royal family on their own lavish lifestyle. And some of this was also due to the government funding proxy wars against the British. For example, our own revolution, right, was accomplished with a good bit of French assistance and French money. Not because King Louis XVI was such a big believer in American democracy, but because cutting off Britain's North American colonies would weaken the British, right? So he was funding us as what seemed like a smart geopolitical move at the time, until the economy crashed. So the Crown makes some concessions after the storming of the Bastille, and in particular, after what was usually regarded as an advisory body to the king and the government called the Estates Generales, votes to approve a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. On August the 26th of 1789. Now, the Estates Generales was made up of representatives of what were regarded as the 3 main bodies of French society. Have any of you ever heard of the political theory of the 3 estates? Okay, so what do you know about it, Jamal?
I think one of them had the aristocrats, another one had like the royals, I think, and the other one had everyone else.
Yeah, that is more or less correct. This is actually a medieval way of organizing society, right? It's built on medieval philosophy. So, in Latin, the 3 estates are the oratores, those who pray, right? So, the church. The bellatores, those who fight. So the aristocracy. And this is a reminder that the original purpose of an aristocracy was military, right? That nobles were originally granted land so that they were able to afford a horse and armor so they could serve as knights in the king's army, right? And so that they could, raise enough citizens and a peasant levy, that sort of thing. And the last class, the last of the three estates, was the laboratories, those who work. And this refers to the great unwashed, right? Basically everybody else. And one of the things about this three estates theory is it didn't matter what kind of work you did, right? There's no distinction here between white-collar work and blue-collar work. There's no distinction between, say, a lawyer and a farm laborer. Everybody is in this class if they're not an aristocrat and they're not a churchman. What were you going to say, Jamal?
Didn't each estate only get like one vote?
Yeah. That was another issue, is that all three estates had the same amount of representation in the Estates General, which meant that the great mass of the population only had as much representation as the two upper classes did, right? Which meant that these two working together could always veto anything that this third group wanted. So this is what I was talking about when I mentioned like the overthrow of not just the monarchy but also the church, right? Because these two forces were seen as always being in collusion with each other. Well, they were, right? They propped each other up. So, Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, approved by the Estates General on the 26th of August. Now, this leads to a couple months of relative peace. Then, on the 5th of October, 1789, occurs the event that Wollstonecraft and Burke are both talking about. What's often referred to as the Women's March to Versailles or simply the March to Versailles. It's referred to as the Women's March because it was actually led by Parisian women. And most of the people in the crowd were women. There were men who came along as well. But this group gathered in the center of Paris. They got together whatever weapons they could grab. They managed to get a hold of a cannon somehow. And they dragged all of these implements, plus themselves, their children, whatever they had with them, all the way out from the center of Paris to Versailles, which is, I forget exactly what the distance is. It's something like 20 miles from the city. So, this is a trek that would take them, at the very least, the better part of a day, right? And remember that they're carrying a lot of shit, too. So by the time they get to Versailles to register their complaints to the king, they're tired, they're thirsty, they're sore, and they find out that this bastard's been holding out on them, right? They discover that the king's bakeries are full of bread, and people simply go ballistic. The king, in consultation with his ministers, decides the best thing for him to do is to allow the masses to take him prisoner and to take him to one of the royal palaces within the city of Paris, where he and his family are held under house arrest for quite some time until they are finally executed. Right, so the king is not killed after the March to Versailles, and in fact, much of the violence that Burke describes didn't actually happen. But we'll get to that in a minute, right? And so these are the basic events leading up to the overthrow of the monarchy, and to which Burke and Wollstonecraft are responding. both roughly a year later, right? So both of their pamphlets are written and published, right, with a really, really quick like the turnaround on Wollstonecraft's pamphlet is quite fast. They're both published in November 1790. And by this time, both of them have plenty of access to newspaper articles, reports, and various correspondence, right? People they write letters to back and forth, coming out of France. So, what did you make? So let's start digging into these texts a little bit now, right? So let's start with Edmund Burke, because his is the earlier response. What did you guys think of Burke's arguments?
Bias.
Okay, why did you think he was biased?
The way he describes the queen, it's obvious that he has a sort of adoration for her.
Yeah, okay, yeah, the way he describes the queen is a little funny, right? Let's go there. Because I think that this actually is central to several of Burke's arguments, right? Can we go to page 201? And can I get a volunteer to start reading the first full paragraph on page 201, I hear and I rejoice to hear. Anybody?
I'll look some other back.
Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
I hear and I rejoice to hear that the great lady, the other object of the trumpet, has borne that day. One is interested that beings made for suffering should suffer well, and that she bears all succeeding days, that she bears the imprisonment of her husband and her own captivity, and the exile of her friends, and the insulting adulation of addresses. And the whole weight of her accumulated wrongs with a severe patience and a manner suited to her rank and race, and becoming the offspring of a sovereign distinguished for her pity and courage. That, like her, she lawfully sentiments that she feels with dignity of Roman matron, that in the last extremity she will save herself from the last disgrace, and that if she must fall, she will fall by a noble hand.
Okay, so thank you, Aaron. So let's start with this paragraph here. What do you notice in this paragraph about the way Burke describes the Queen's attitudes and feelings, or the attitudes and feelings of Marie Antoinette?
He kind of goes for an emotional approach.
Okay, why would you? What suggests emotion here to you?
He tries to create kind of tries to make readers kind of feel bad for her, because he talks about how her husband's prisoner, how she's being held captive,
Yeah.
and her friends are exiled.
Yeah, and what is this last sentence referring to here, right? This idea that the last extremity she will save herself from the last disgrace, and if she must fall, she will fall by no ignoble hand. What's this last disgrace that he's talking about?
And at the bottom it talks about she'd rather kill herself than go through that.
Yeah, and there are suggestions of sexual assault throughout this passage, right? We'll go back and we'll sort of pull this theme out in a minute. Now, what about the dignity that Marie Antoinette displays according to Burke's reading of her? Where does he say it comes from? Yeah, go ahead.
At some point it mentions her mother, her lineage.
Yeah, this idea of inherited dignity, right? Inherited qualities that give one the right to rule. This is also very closely related to Burke's overall argument.
I felt that
Mhm.
mentioned, because, and it was mentioned in the rebuttal,
Mhm.
how essentially he couldn't identify with the other side because he could
Uh-huh.
only see their point of view with him being
Mhm.
in a higher level of society.
Yeah, I think one thing was that, like, because these are argumentative pieces, right? Both authors do have a particular bias, right? And I think that is a thing that we do need to know, right? That Burke is biased towards the aristocratic viewpoint, and Wollstonecraft has a bias towards the viewpoint of, like, the third estate, the ordinary people, right? They're both advocating for their particular position, the side they feel most strongly attached to, right? But let's continue with this. The second paragraph here on page 201 about Marie Antoinette. So can somebody read that for us, starting with, it is now 16 or 17 years.
It is now
Thank
16
you,
or
Nick.
17. It is now 16 or 17 years since I saw the Queen of France, then the Dauphiness, at Versailles, and surely never lighted up on this orb, which she hardly seemed to touch, a more delightful vision. I saw her just above the horizon, decorating and cheering in the elevated sphere. She just began to move in, glittering like the morning star, full of life and splendor and joy. Oh, what a revolution, and what a heart must I have to contemplate without emotion that elevation and that fall. Little did I dream when she added titles of veneration to those of enthusiastic, distant, respectful love, that she should ever be obliged to carry the sharp antidote against disgrace concealed in that bosom. Little did I dream that I should have lived to see such disasters fallen upon her in a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honor and of cavaliers. I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever.
Okay, thank you. You can stop there. I think we've kind of made the point here, right? So what do you notice about this lengthy descriptive passage that Burke devotes to Marie Antoinette?
That the people liked her and they looked at her wrong, they would like protect her.
I'm sorry?
Like if people thought about her the wrong way and looked at her the wrong way, that the people would come to her aid.
Who specifically is expecting should come to her aid?
Soldiers.
Well, slightly more generally than soldiers, right?
Or people.
You said more what than a soldier?
A little bit more general than soldiers, but more specific than people.
Me?
Yeah, that any man ought to be willing to leap to her defense, right? Any gentleman certainly would do so, if even a look threatened her with insult. So, what we see here is in Burke a notion of masculine responsibility, right? Of male responsibility for the protection and defense of women, that he says sort of comes from chivalry. Now, if we trace the roots of the word chivalry, right? Does anybody know where the word chivalry comes from? Or what it refers to? What do we usually mean when we talk about chivalry?
Essentially, someone's a gentleman, they do respectable things for women.
Yeah, or at least, yeah, things that, like, most of the things that an older generation would regard as respectful, right? Like, holding the door for a woman, not necessarily doing so for another man, right? Putting down your coat in a puddle so that your lady fair can step on it and not the puddle, right? And a kind of like defense of feminine virtue, right? Now, Wollstonecraft and other early feminists would argue that this idea of chivalry is actually designed to keep women helpless, and operates from the assumption that they can't do anything for themselves. Chivalry, the word itself, actually comes from the French chevalier, which means a knight. So it has military roots, but it's also rooted in this conception of what a nobleman or what a gentleman should behave like, right? So the use of the word chivalry has specific class connotations, specific class attachments. Now, we talked about Edmund Burke a little bit at the end of last class as well. What do we remember about Burke from our discussion last time, if anything? What else was he known for writing?
The beautiful and sublime treatise.
Yeah, that treatise on the beautiful and the sublime, right? So Burke was, at the time he wrote this, Burke was a member of Parliament. He was a well-known political figure, but he was best known as an aesthetic theorist, right? As an art critic, really. In particular,
Wasn't it like to invoke fear?
what's that?
Wasn't like sublime meant to invoke fear and make you feel like powerless?
Yes, exactly. The sublime is that aesthetic sensation that evokes awe or fear, usually by making you feel tiny or powerless, right? Now, from there, the beautiful, by contrast, is that which excites desire, right? So he seems to be citing Marie Antoinette here as an example of the beautiful, right? Something to be desired, cherished, and protected. Let's look on page 200. These two paragraphs, which describe the actual storming of Versailles, right? History, who keeps a durable record of all our acts, and exercises her awful censure over the proceedings of all sorts of sovereigns, will not forget either those events or the era of this liberal refinement in the intercourse of mankind. History will record that on the morning of the 6th of October, 1789, the King and Queen of France, after a day of confusion, alarm, dismay, and slaughter, lay down, under the pledged security of public faith, to indulge nature in a few hours of respite and troubled melancholy repose. From this sleep the Queen was first startled by the voice of the sentinel at her door, who cried out to her to save herself by flight, that this was the last proof of fidelity he could give, that they were upon him and he was dead. Instantly he was cut down. A band of cruel ruffians and assassins, reeking with his blood, rushed into the chamber of the Queen, and pierced with 100 strokes of bayonets and poniards the bed, from whence this persecuted woman had but just time to fly almost naked, and through ways unknown to the murderers had escaped to seek refuge at the feet of a king and husband, not secure of his own life for a moment. Two things to note about this, right? One, it didn't happen. Right? This is a completely imagined episode. In fact, Burke himself should have known better. His own son was acquainted with certain members of the King and Queen's Royal Guard, and would have been able to tell his father, no, actually, no one attacked the private royal chambers, right? That did not happen. The people did not breach the royal residence. And nobody was killed in the March on Versailles. But what does this kind of read like? If we think back to things we've already looked at in this class.
Like the Gothic novel.
Yeah, especially that kind of female Gothic model, right? Where the virtue of, some, virginal woman is threatened by dark, dastardly forces, right? And so she has to flee from her chambers to the chambers of her husband for protection, right?
He kind of paints her in a very pure state throughout all of his
Yeah,
descriptions.
which, by the way, is not the way her own people saw her, pretty much. She was not, like, neither she nor her husband were especially popular, as we can see, right? The other thing here, too, is like that we see here, again, this kind of suggestion of sexual assault, right? And the queen fleeing almost naked from the bedchamber, and the invaders stabbing the bed with bayonets and swords, right? So there is this implied sexual threat from the revolutionaries throughout. Now there's something else in Burke's description that I want to focus on a little bit before we move on to Wollstonecraft. In the second paragraph here on page 200. This king, to say no more of him, and this queen, and their infant children, who once would have been the pride and hope of a great and generous people, were then forced to abandon the sanctuary of the most splendid palace in the world, right? Sounds like a fairy tale. Which they left swimming in blood, polluted by massacre, and strewed with scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses. Thence they were conducted into the capital of their kingdom. Two had been selected from the unprovoked, unresisted, promiscuous slaughter, which was made of the gentlemen of birth and family who composed the king's bodyguard. These two gentlemen, with all the parade of an execution of justice, were cruelly and publicly dragged to the block and beheaded in the great court of the palace. Their heads were stuck upon spears and led the procession, whilst the royal captives who followed in the train were slowly moved along amidst the horrid yells and shrilling screams and frantic dances and infamous contumelies and all the unutterable abominations of the furies of hell in the abused shape of the vilest of women. After they had been made to taste, drop by drop, more than the bitterness of death, in the slow torture of a journey of 12 miles protracted to 6 hours, they were, under a guard, composed of those very soldiers who had thus conducted them through this famous triumph, lodged in one of the old palaces of Paris, now converted into a Bastille for kings. What do we notice here about the way he describes the situation of the palace and the leading figures in all of this carnage?
As the victim.
Okay, yeah, the king and queen are the real victims here, right? And these, the floor is strewn with blood and scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses, right? This is, again, like, this is all horror story language.
I noticed that the women he describes for the people are
Uh-huh.
the complete opposite of how he describes the queen.
Yes, bingo. The Parisian women are set up here as a counterpoint to Marie Antoinette, right? This is slightly before he talks about Marie Antoinette, right? But he's giving us the negative example of feminine behavior, what he thinks is wrong, right? Before he gives us what he thinks is right. He's giving us women dancing and shouting and swimming in blood. And then giving us the noble, dignified, abused personage of the queen, right?
So they use it to the people, like when they cut off their heads as examples, like not to mess with them. Does that make sense? Like, okay, this is what happens when you try to mess with the king and queen.
Well, no, the king and queen aren't cutting off people's heads, right? It's the, he's saying that the people are cutting off the heads of the kings and queens' guards, right? That they're seizing these young noblemen and beheading them. The king and queen are, in Burke's view of things, completely innocent of any violence. And again, it should be noted that the beheadings described here don't actually happen, right? This is all from Burke's imagination. Now, They would start chopping off the heads of aristocrats a little later, right? But even at the time Burke was writing in November 1790, that hadn't happened yet.
Do you think that it kind of gave him the idea for it? I know before you mentioned that the writers affected, towards the...
Probably not, because Burke's work would have had a lot more traction in Britain than in France. So yes, this was very widely distributed in Britain. Burke's arguments were really popular in Britain. But yeah, I can't really speak to how widely they would have circulated in France. Probably not as well. So Burke is approaching the Revolution essentially from the standpoint of a conservative novelist. And one thing I do want to ask before we move on to Wollstonecraft, how easy did you find Burke to read? I see you shaking your head, Serenity. What was difficult about reading Burke?
He just said so much stuff. I was just trying to figure out what was his point. He just had so much, and the other author, it was she was describing him as contradicting himself.
Yeah.
It was way easier to read her stuff because it was way easier understanding his stuff by reading hers.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that I want everybody to get out of this too is that the argument is part of this, the style is part of the argument, right? Burke isn't writing like this because, his arguments are weak and he's making shit up, right? But he is writing like this also in part to show his alignment with the beautiful against the sublime, right? So he writes these very ornate, lengthy sentences, where he piles description upon description upon description, right? And that's what matters, right? He talks at one point about, not wanting to take the drapery away from life, right? Not wanting to take ornamentation away from everyday life. The drapery and the ornamentation are what he values, not so much what's beneath it, right? What's beneath it, like life laid naked, is ugly. So the beautiful is something you lay on top of life to make it bearable. So Burke is very much pro-drapery and pro-ornamentation, right? Not only that, because he's also something of an elitist, he'd probably say that if you didn't understand his argument, you weren't supposed to. Right? That, if you said to him, I didn't get this, he'd just respond, well, good, you weren't, good, it wasn't meant for you. Which also doesn't exactly endear him to us, right?
Reminds me of my mother.
We're going to see this attitude again in the early 20th century in modernism, right? When we look at poets like T.S. Eliot who are writing these very self-consciously difficult poems, right? And I will walk you through all of this stuff so that you get it, right? But Eliot wouldn't have bothered. In fact, Eliot would have, deliberately put footnotes in his poems that were intended to further confuse you. Because again, like Burke, he's thinking, well, if you don't get it, you're not supposed to. Now, what about Mary Wollstonecraft? How does Wollstonecraft start her argument?
Hers was kind of blunt to the point.
Yeah, she went straight up.
She immediately went into saying that she was suffering from indignation.
Yes, indignation is very different from indigestion, right?
When she said, she does not consent to cool my words to avoid the ambiguous phrase. She keeps telling us she's not going to do it like she's going to be. I guess you could say very blunt, straight up.
Yeah, if we look at the first couple of paragraphs, she's actually kind of making fun of him, right? She's imitating his style, but also talking about the ways in which his style is deficient for making arguments, right? Right. Page 204, it is not necessary with courtly insincerity, right? Courtly meaning aristocratic, to apologize to you for thus intruding on your precious time, nor to profess that I think it an honor to discuss an important subject with a man whose literary abilities have raised him to notice in the state. And words like courtly and literary are very pointed here, right? She's noting that Burke doesn't have the standing to make arguments about this, right? It's like, you're an art critic, buddy. Stick to what you know. I have not yet learned to twist my periods, nor, in the equivocal idiom of politeness, to disguise my sentiments and imply what I should be afraid to utter. If, therefore, in the course of this epistle, I chance to express contempt and even indignation with some emphasis, I beseech you to believe that it is not a flight of fancy. For truth in morals has ever appeared to me the essence of the sublime, and in taste, simplicity the only criterion of the beautiful. Again, like using his own language and criteria against him, right? So it's clear that she knows his work, she understands it, and is able to use his previous work and his style to undermine him. And then after these couple of paragraphs, this is when she reverts to more of a plain style, right? You know, once she says, quitting now the flowers of rhetoric, let us, sir, reason together, right? Okay, enough with this frippery, right? Enough with all of this verbal bullshit back and forth. Let's just lay out here what the facts are and why your arguments don't add up. So she is promising from the beginning of this part to be straight with the reader, right? Or with the you she's referring to, Edmund Burke, right? Remember, this is all written kind of directly to Burke, though, of course, with a broader audience in mind. Did you notice anything particularly interesting in the arguments that she makes?
She repeated herself kind of a bit on her emotions regarding what he had to say.
Uh-huh.
She kind of made fun of him.
She makes fun of him a good bit, yeah, especially near the beginning, right? And I think one big difference between the two has to do with their attitudes towards human rights, right? Burke does not believe in human rights in the abstract. He believes that what rights you have are essentially a legal construct that they're inherited from your forebears, right? And thus, no one can expect rights to equal things, or there can be no equality of outcomes. Wollstonecraft does believe in human rights in the abstract, and that the rights of a French person and the rights of an English person are no different, right? That there is a base level of human rights to which everyone is entitled, and not just by the laws of whatever kingdom they belong to. So that's one of the big assumptions from which she's operating, one of the places on which she tends to hit Burke. But there's something else that I want to note here near the end of her piece.
Doesn't she kind of call like Burke barbaric because he uses like the Gothic style?
I'm sorry?
Like, doesn't she kind of make it Burke is like barbaric because he uses the Gothic style?
Yeah, she accuses him of clinging to I think she uses the phrase the rust of antiquity at various points. So it's like, you are clinging to old, outmoded ways of thinking simply because you think they're attractive, because you think they're pretty, right? And this is all actually, again, very closely tied in to the idea of the Gothic, right? Both of these texts are closely related to themes that emerge in those Gothic novels that we looked at last time. Does anybody remember anything about the way homes and gardens were constructed from our discussion last time?
They're very ornate and traditional.
Yeah, people built these ornate gardens, right? And filled them with these new little buildings that were made to look old-fashioned, right? So you might put, like a ruined Roman temple in your garden, right? It wasn't there before. It's artificially ruined. People would bring in exotic trees and plants, right? So they would build these beautiful pleasure gardens and fill them with what were called follies. Right? She makes direct reference to this near the beginning of the essay, and then this pops up again on page 208. I know indeed that there is often something disgusting in the distresses of poverty, at which the imagination revolts and starts back to exercise itself in the more attractive Arcadia of fiction. The rich man builds a house. Art and taste give it the highest finish. His gardens are planted, and the trees grow to recreate the fancy of the planter, though the temperature of the climate may rather force him to avoid the dangerous damp they exhale than seek the umbrageous retreat. Everything on the estate is cherished but man. Yet, to contribute to the happiness of man is the most sublime of all enjoyments. But if, instead of sweeping pleasure grounds, obelisks, temples, and elegant cottages as objects for the eye, the heart was allowed to beat true to nature, decent farms would be scattered over the estate, and plenty smile around. Instead of the poor being subject to the griping hand of an avaricious steward, they would be watched over with fatherly solicitude by the man whose duty and pleasure it was to guard their happiness and shield from rapacity the beings who, by the sweat of their brow, exalted him above his fellows. So what does Wollstonecraft seem to think of this building of pleasure gardens and of Gothic follies by English aristocrats?
They're very, it's simply showy ways to exploit the work of others.
Well, are they even exploiting people on purpose by doing this necessarily?
I don't think so.
But yeah, if they're giving over their lands to these exotic plants that need all this special care to be grown, if they're giving their lands over to these little fake chapels and ruined temples and Chinese pagodas, right? What's not being done with their lands?
Well, beneficial use is not being used for, something that could benefit the people.
Yeah, it's being used, the land is being used then only for the pleasure and amusement of a private individual, right? Rather than for the sustenance and nourishment of a broader community. So these Gothic follies and these pleasure gardens are, to Wollstonecraft, an enormous waste because they require all of this work and all of this care, but it's all for the benefit and the pleasure of one person or one family, right?
Yeah, I can only like in the bottom there,
Uh-huh.
how he gives the reference to a bold picturesque landscaping. Like it's just like good to the eye. Like
Yeah.
he said in that too. Like it's just all basically like all for show.
Yeah, it's pretty, it's amusing, right? But because these trees, some of these trees even exhale unhealthy damps, right? You can't even sit in the shade next to them. They're just for the eye. And if you're only thinking about what pleases the eye, what's aesthetically beautiful, and not thinking at all about stomach, and not just your stomach, but everyone else's, then that leads to these selfish uses of land, right? Reminding as well the aristocrat at the end of the paragraph right here, what his wealth is founded on, right? It's founded on the work of other people. It's founded on the sweat of other people's brows. And the least you can do for them is use that land to grow them some damn food, right? Tear down the pagodas. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this stuff? We're running sort of close to time here. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just like the timeline.
Uh-huh.
Like after the king, like is there any more events that we should know for the French Revolution?
Not for right now. We'll get into some more of that stuff next time. Because we're going to be talking about the continual, not quite so low-grade war with France that continues into the early 19th century, particularly when France is under Napoleon. In fact, we're going to see that this creates a great deal of defensiveness and conservatism in British culture that is connected in a variety of ways to Romanticism. So what we're doing over these couple of sessions is kind of working our way into early Romanticism by looking at some stuff that comes before. Yes?
I have a theory that I just wanted to kind of, do you think that, like the Gothic and such, it was kind of posed the questions to, I can't remember where I was reading it, but psychologists have wondered why. Do you think it's because they no longer had such strict places, we'll just say places, strict places in religion that they started seeking something?
Okay, as we start to see social hierarchies becoming a little bit looser, people are a little bit more unsure about their place in society, people are becoming a little bit more, bit more skeptical in religion. Yeah, I think those are probably all factors that play into the rise of something like the Gothic, which is really kind of about these terrors that erupt from dark places, right? In fact, a lot of readings of the Gothic focus on what Freud called the return of the repressed. I don't really go in much for Freudian readings, so I didn't really talk much about this. But yeah, this is a phrase that is often used by psychoanalytic critics of the Gothic, who are more interested in it as a psychological, as a representation of the human psyche. Like, I was more interested in it as a kind of publishing and distribution phenomenon, right? And the ways in which it's connected to material culture, in part because, as I said on day one, right, that's the shit that I'm interested in. That's the stuff I care about. But yeah, someone who's more interested in psychology than I am would probably be using this phrase a lot. That, yeah, it's a kind of eruption of the things that society kept tamped down.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Comments, theories?
This was fun.
Was it? Good. Good, I'm glad. Okay.